Hey guys, Naz here with another tutorial. Today I'm going to be taking you over how to pattern and sew hips. This is definitely a topic that a lot of people, especially beginners, have trouble with. I know I certainly did when I started making plushies. It's much easier for me to show you rather than explain to you how it works, just because of the twists and turns that this pattern needs to take for it to all fit together. So I'm going to start off by patterning just a simple hip, and then we will go and sew it, and it should make a lot more sense to you how this sort of thing works. So as usual, I've opened up my nice little document in Photoshop. I've got my pen tool ready, and now we are going to just draw a simple little pony pattern, because that's what I like to demonstrate most of my pattern making tutorials on. Okay, so now we've drawn our little pattern. I would say this probably would be a filly pattern going by the little chibi proportions that I've used here. And what I've done is, instead of having the leg look like this, as you would on a pattern without the hip, I've extended the line as far as I want that hip to go up the side pattern piece. Now you can definitely have it shorter if you would like, or you can have it longer. It just depends on your personal taste. I personally find it's easier to make a larger hip if you make this line go up a little bit further. The purpose of this line is to break up our side pattern piece, and our inner leg piece is essentially going to form a little gusset that's going to push this line, that's going to fit between the cut of this line, but that will become easier to understand once I show you with an actual sewn example. So now that we've got our side piece patterned, you're going to make a copy of that, and what we're going to do is we're going to pattern the inside of our back leg. If you saw my last tutorial on how to pattern butts, you'll know that we create sort of a little half moon shaped sort of thing going up the rump, so I'm going to include a butt on this pattern just because it's what I typically use in my personal patterns. Now what we want to do is we want to do pretty much the opposite for the other side of our inner leg. Our inner leg is going to include the outline of this outside piece, but it is going to have this little Y shape up the top. This will be the inside of the rump, and this will be the little gusset that goes in between our thigh. So we're going to decide how deep and wide we want our rump. As discussed in my previous tutorial, you don't have to use a rump at all. You could simply have your pattern go something like this if you did not want to have a rump. But we go down into sort of this Y shape, go down as far as you would like. I would generally keep it around this sort of area, and then we're going to loop back up to the top of our hip. Now we have our back inner leg piece to go with our outer piece. So I'm going to separate that just to make it easier for you guys. So essentially this area here is what is going to be the little gusset, a gusset being a piece of fabric that adds width between a seam. So we're going to be, as I will show you, we're going to be cutting this line, and we are going to be fitting this piece between the cut that we make, but that'll be much easier to understand once I actually show you guys what we're doing. So with this little point here, you can make it skinnier if you would like, so something more like this. I wouldn't make it too much fatter than sort of this. If it gets too wide, you're going to really distort your pattern shape. It's going to look a bit strange. So the more you practice and the more you pattern these hips, the more you get a feel for how wide you will need them to be. This is going to give me quite a wide extreme hip here, as it is with the volume that I've included in this little point. So really, it's quite easy. You're just following, as I said, using the line that you've already drawn for your side pattern piece to draw your inner piece. You don't want to be changing any of these lines here that we've already drawn because they're going to match up perfectly with your outside leg piece. So now that that's all patterned, I'm probably going to only sew the rear half of this pony. So for this tutorial we're going to need to include a little gusset. Our gusset is going to start at about here and probably go to somewhere up here. So it'll be much easier for you to understand when we're actually sewing the colour-coded pieces. But I'm just going to pattern a nice little gusset to go along with this tutorial. I've covered how to make gussets in several other videos if you'd like to go back and check those out. Okay, so now everything we need to make this nice pony hip is patterned, and I'm going to print it out and I'll take you guys over to the sewing machine where I will show you how to sew this rear of a pony that includes both a rump and a kicked out hip, or flank is, I think flank is the technical term for this area on a real horse. Alright guys, so now we've printed out all our pattern pieces. We have our side piece, our little gusset and our inner leg piece, and I'm going to be cutting these out of corresponding colours so it's easy for you to see what piece is doing what. I'm going to start off by cutting our main side pieces out of red and just making sure that the nap is going in the correct direction. So I have my nap going down and the fabric facing wrong side up as normal, and I'm just going to get a little pen and I'm going to draw the outline of our side pattern piece. Once I've traced the outline, I'm getting a pair of scissors and I'm cutting up that line that we drew that goes into the middle of our pattern and marking that on our fabric piece. Now I'm just going to continue to trace the remainder of our pattern pieces as normal, and then we'll get to cutting them out. When you get up to cutting out your side pattern pieces, as you can see here in red, I'm just going to take my rotary tool and cut all the outside of the pattern. I'm then going to use a pair of scissors to cut along that line and no further. This is where we're going to be sewing in between. You can cut it with a rotary tool, but this is open to a lot of error, so I would suggest using scissors just to be a little bit more careful. We'll now take our pieces over to be pinned. So we're going to take our side pattern pieces and we're going to flip them over so the right side is facing up. You then want to take the corresponding inner leg pieces and lay the right sides together onto your side pieces. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pin the key points. So I'm going to get my nice glass head pins and I'm going to start off by pinning the bottom of the feet. These are really easy to line up. I'm also going to pin the back of the leg and the top of the rump. It's easier just to pin the back area first because that's a little bit more simple. So now I'll just go and fill the rest of the area in with pins, going in the center points of where you previously pinned, and just filling as much as you think is necessary for your particular sewing. I like to use a lot of pins, especially when I'm sewing exact things like rumps and hips, just to stop Minky slipping anywhere. That we've finished pinning the rear of our pattern, we're going to do the same to the front of our leg piece. The front of our inner leg piece is going to correspond with this little front area of our outside leg. we're going to pin the top of our inner leg piece, that point, to the top of the line that we cut. You'll notice that we have no seam allowance marked. That's okay, because we're just going to sew as close as possible to the seam, making sure that we're not going over. I suggest pinning the top point, then the bottom of your hoof, and then start by filling in your points in between. This will make sure that your pieces are pinned nice and evenly. You can see here that we're just going to pin as close as possible to that raw edge and align that with the front of our inner leg piece, and just continue to do so. I use a huge amount of pins where I'm sewing right next to this raw edge that doesn't have a seam allowance, just because you want to get it as close as possible without the fabric slipping. Once I've put all those pins in, I'm going to take the rest of my pins, flip the piece over, and pin between every pin you see here on the opposite side. I just find that this stops the fabric slipping even more so, and it stops the fabric from curling in on itself, which I find happens a lot with Minky if you only pin on one side. So you can see just how many pins I'm using here. You can use even more when you're starting out, because it'll just make things a lot easier for yourself. Once you've finished pinning, you're going to take this piece over to your sewing machine, and you're very carefully going to sew both these seam lines that we've just pinned. I've sewn both those seam lines, and you can see here where we have sewn. So the back of our inside leg piece has gone on the back of our outside leg piece, and you can see here that we've just sewn as close as possible to that naked edge without going over, and that's going to correspond with the front of our inner leg piece. This next step is where things get a little tricky, and I think is where people get hooked up on this element of patterning. What we need to do is we need to get the opposite end of the front of our inner leg piece, the bit that I'm pointing to just here, and that is going to be sewn against the loose edge of that little line that we've cut. So you can see here, you want to pinch the top of the line and guide that red piece, that red seam edge, down along the inner curve of that front inner leg piece. Just making sure that you have your right side to right sides together as per normal, and you want to first pin the top of the pink piece to the top of the seam that we cut that line apart with, and that's just going to make sure it lines up nicely. Now what we have to do is we have to straighten out that pink piece, and we're going to neatly as possible pin along that line through to the other side of the red seam, and we're just going to follow this all the way down until we get to the bottom of the seam on the red piece. I apologise for my pants, they're not actually dirty, it's just airbrush ink that has got into them that never seems to wash out. So that's a bonus for airbrush ink. Createx paints don't seem to wash out, which is good for airbrushing on your plush, but not so much getting on your pants. So hopefully now you guys have a better idea of how these pieces fit together. You can see that the point of that inner leg piece has become our little hip insert. Now what we want to do, like before, is pin the opposite side between the pins we've already placed, just to make sure that none of our Minky is curling under itself, and to make it much easier for us to sew this tricky little piece. It can be easier to do this by hand, but if you're confident with your machine, give it a go and see if you can get it that way. I've taken the piece over to my machine just to show you guys how I sew. My machine is fine with sewing over pins. Make sure that you're using thin glass head pins if you're going to be sewing over them, and just be careful, obviously doing this at your own risk, because there always is a risk of breaking pins. But personally, I sew over pins on every single plush I make, and I very rarely have a problem, but just make sure that your machine is fine with that. So we've sewn along that line, and we're just going to snip our threads and I'll show you guys how that turned out. As you can see, our seam follows the inner curve of the front inner leg piece, and it also follows that little raw seam edge of the outside piece along that line that we cut. So you can see here how that pink piece adds width to our flat outer piece, because it is pushing width between that seam where before there was no width. So now we're just going to sew the remainder of our plush as you would normally, just so I can show you guys the finished product and what this looks like when it's all stuffed. On most of my quadruped patterns, once I've done the legs and obviously added the hooves or paws, I'm going to pin the back of the pattern. This would obviously go further if you were sewing an entire plush, and as you saw in my plush rump making tutorial, I'm going to pin down the rump, which is going to form the crack of our rump. And then, same as before, I'm going to pin between all the pins I've already put in on the opposite side. Once I've sewn along that seam and I've clipped my seam allowance, I'm going to add my little gusset that goes underneath, starting at the bottom of the rump and going along the belly. You're just going to treat the lower edge of where you've made this hip as you would any side piece. It doesn't really affect how it attaches to the gusset whatsoever, except that you have a little seam to sew over, which is really no problem. Once that's all pinned, this is what it's going to look like, and you have your nice little edge of your gusset running up the the crotch of your pony. This is how all my pony patterns go together, and it's how a lot of other people's go together as well. It's a pretty common method. Now that our entire pattern is sewn, you can see how it all fits together. You have the pink inner leg pieces that form the rump and the insets in the hips. You have the red pieces that form the outside, and you have the little blue piece that is our gusset. So I'll just turn this inside out for you so you can get a better idea of how this all fits together. You can see our little hip there, underneath, and here's what it looks like all stuffed. Obviously this pattern is just very basic, I just whipped it together in about 2 seconds, but you can see that our hips were very effective. My rump wasn't really patterned correctly, so it has splayed out the back legs a bit. You can find that adding very large hips will splay out the front of your legs. So just keep this in mind when you're patterning, not to make your little inner pink piece too extreme, because it can distort the rest of your pattern. Just make it large enough to get that 3D shape that you're after, and there's your patterned hip. I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful. I have had a lot of people ask me how to make hips, and it's really hard to explain just through text. So I hope this visual guide gave you some help, and you will pattern a bunch of quadruped hip patterns. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you guys in the next tutorial. Just a reminder that I don't read the YouTube comments on these videos, so if you have a question, send me a personal message on Patreon. Bye guys!